to the Humans vs. Retirement podcast with financial planner and retirement specialist Dan Haylett. In this podcast, Dan explores ways to help you overcome the behavioural, emotional and financial challenges of life after work. Join Dan for the journey where he will explore how our wonderful human brain will naturally fight against what it takes to live a happy, healthy and wealthy retirement. Dan will draw on years of expertise, experience and expert guests to solve the behavioural, emotional and financial challenges of life after work. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to the Humans vs. Retirement podcast. I'm your host, Dan Haylett. And in this episode, we are going to focus on the financial challenges posed to us in retirement, as I'm delighted to welcome to the show founder of Retirement Researcher, Professor of Retirement Income at the American College of Financial Services, published researcher and author, Wade Pfau. Wade, welcome to the Humans vs. Retirement podcast.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me on your show.
Wade, it's a pleasure. And thank you so much for taking time all the way from Dallas, Texas to join us today. You've got your morning coffee. I've got my evening coffee. So we're caffeined up, ready for a great conversation. So, Wade, I am really excited to have this conversation as kind of... You are one of, I think, the world's leading experts on retirement income strategies, and you're actively researching this and publishing your findings in some of the most prestigious journals and media outlets in the States, which is, you're doing some amazing work, and thank you for that, because I know it's very numbers orientated and you're crunching these things all of the time and working on them. You've authored 4 brilliant books, which links will be in the show notes, specifically focused on retirement planning, income strategies, and spending. And you're obviously very much in the weeds of this stuff every day, looking at how people can generate income and have a worry-free retirement. So I can't wait to kick off this conversation. And we were talking before hitting record, and I think there's 3 areas that I'd love to dig deep with you on. And they're 3 areas that you've done a huge amount of research on, and you've published some fantastic papers, and they're within your books and on your website. One of those is retirement income styles, which I think is a fascinating piece of work around how people and their psychological profile kind of blends in with the type of income style that they need. How we then spend our money in the real world. So it's all very well putting this on a spreadsheet, but how do we spend our money in the real world? And then really, the difference between safe withdrawal rates and optimal withdrawal rates. So what is optimal for a person? So I'd love us to dive in. And I think kicking off with what your views are and the research that you've done around retirement income styles and the relevant strategies off the back of that.
Yeah, and in terms of retirement income styles, so much of my focus has been on the quantitative side of looking at different retirement strategies, seeing how they perform, and ultimately becoming rather agnostic to this point. There are many financial service professionals that really devote themselves to one particular approach, who believe that approach is optimal for everyone. And at the end of the day, I don't think that's the case. And I think that if people can find an approach that resonates with them and that they're comfortable sticking with, they're going to have a much better shot at a successful retirement. And so going back 10 or 15 years, there's this conversation around, can I just spend from an investment portfolio? Do I want some sort of bucketing approach where I invest differently based on the time horizon? Do I want to build a floor of protected income through financial products like annuities and then invest on top of that? And again, they're all viable approaches. And this is where, in working with Alex Murguia, a colleague of mine at Retirement Researcher, he has a PhD in psychology. So he brought that perspective. And we tried to understand, how can an individual actually select from these different retirement strategies to find an approach they're comfortable with? And that led to this idea of the retirement income style awareness, where we read as much as we could about how people describe retirement planning and the types of trade-offs that are out there where it's necessary to make a decision. We wrote questions trying to understand, how do people view these trade-offs? Which direction do they lean? then we crunched all the numbers on that and found there's 2 primary factors. And really, that's all you need. But there's also 4 secondary factors that help to further tell the story about a retirement style, which then translates into one of these retirement strategies as an approach for building a retirement income plan. So with these 2 primary factors, the one is, it's what I used to call these 2 different schools of thought for retirement. There's the probability-based approach, which is just being comfortable relying on the idea that stocks will outperform bonds, and I can depend on that to fund a higher level of spending in my retirement through a diversified portfolio than if I just invested in bonds alone. And then there's the safety first approach, which is, well, I still may have some comfort in the markets, but I don't want to be completely dependent on the financial markets. I'd rather have some sort of contractual protection to cover my core spending, whether that's holding individual bonds to maturity, whether that's using an annuity that can give me the additional risk pooling to fund my retirement. So that's the one factor, safety first versus probability based. The other is optionality versus commitment. Optionality is, I really value flexibility with my approach. I don't want to commit to anything. I don't want to lock anything in. I want to be able to make changes, respond to new situations, and so forth. And I should have emphasized, there's no right answer to any of this. It's really just simply how somebody feels. What are their preferences? Some people have that optionality orientation. Others have a commitment orientation, which is more a sense of, if I can find something that will solve for my lifetime need, I'm comfortable locking that in, committing to that, taking it off my to-do list, protecting myself potentially against cognitive decline, protecting other family members if I'm the one who's been managing the household finances. So there's this commitment orientation. And then there are 4 secondary factors. I don't know if we want to get into all those right now, but just with those primary factors, that leads to 4 different combinations. I could be probability-based, comfortable with the market, and optionality-oriented. So that's a total return investing approach. That's more, I'm comfortable spending from a diversified investment portfolio to cover all of my spending beyond, I may have some sort of public pension or maybe even a private company pension. But if there's still some income gap after that, where I don't have enough reliable income from pensions, that's okay. I'm comfortable just taking distributions from an investment portfolio. There's also, if I'm safety first, contractual protections, and a commitment orientation, that's more the traditional idea of flooring or essential versus discretionary. That's where if I don't have enough pension income, I want to fill that gap through an annuity that provides lifetime income protections to cover my basic spending. And then once that's in place and I have that reliable income covered, then I'll feel comfortable investing on top of that for more discretionary types of goals. And those are the 2 core strategies, the total return, the income protection. The others are more behavioral because they have preferences that are less consistently found together. Safety first and optionality, that's a bucketing approach. I want the contractual protections, and I view that as for short-term spending. And then I want the optionality. I have these long-term buckets that I have a lot of flexibility with, and that I can get through a market downturn because I feel like markets will recover before I ever have to spend those long-term buckets. And then there is the probability-based, comfort with markets, and commitment. And we call that risk wrap. And that's a relatively, probably the newest of the 4 styles in terms of financial innovations. But that's looking for some sort of guardrails. In the United States, the classic tool here would be something like a variable annuity with a lifetime income benefit that lets you still invest the underlying assets for growth, but it has downside protections because you have a protected lifetime income. If markets do poorly and you deplete that asset, you still then trigger an income for the rest of your life. It may be a smaller income than with just a simple income annuity, but you're willing to accept that trade-off in risk wrap because you are more comfortable relying on the markets to provide growth opportunities. And so those are the 4 styles. And I view that as the starting point for thinking about how do I want to build a retirement income strategy. That was a pretty long answer. They won't all be that long, but that's the whole story for that. No,
but I think it's such a valuable framework and starting point because it does take into consideration, I think, a lot of psychological profiles and takes into consideration our views on money, our learned experiences on money, and actually what's most important to us to have within our retirement. And that crucial kind of, I suppose, have fun during the day, sleep well at night, that we all need. I think there are many people out there that say they want one thing, that ultimate flexibility and optionality. However, they don't sleep very well because they're constantly looking at the market. So I think it's a real key area to kind of feel like, actually, I do fit into an area that gives me some flex around certain styles that can actually give me the type of income that I want, that allows me to enjoy the day and sleep at night, which I think is really, really, really crucial. In your research, Wade, with your colleagues, has there been, is there one favoured segment of this over anything else, or has there been a trend towards from one segment to another over the last 10 or 15 years?
No, there's not. Well, we can't really say if there's been a trend because this is new enough that we don't know how people would have answered in the past. Sure. I guess that question never came up quite that way. But in general, we don't think people necessarily change over time in terms of a given individual. We've had the opportunity to do national studies in the US and when markets were doing well, when markets were doing poorly. Our first study was, we were able to ask the same individuals, and it's in economics called a natural experiment, where just coincidentally, our first survey was in March 2020 when the financial markets were collapsing. And it was probably about the scariest time ever to be an investor. And then we asked the same individuals 6 months later when markets were doing much better by that point and vaccines were on the horizon and everything was looking to be a little bit more under control. And people didn't change their answers in that particular survey. It was the same individuals being asked in these two very different market environments. So we think these are relatively consistent preferences that do point to just a starting point for retirement. And like you're saying, in terms of the consumer media, especially at least in the United States, there's an emphasis on the total returns approach. There's something called the 4% rule, which is just a guideline about how much you can spend from an investment portfolio, invested 50 to 75% stocks. It's fairly aggressive asset allocation. But that's really been the default. And study after study that we do with these nationally representative samples shows that about a third of the population seems to resonate with that, which means 2/3 of the population is looking for something that has more of a commitment or a protection that the total return investing approach doesn't provide. And that's the point about sleeping well at night. If you're in a total return strategy, but you're not a total return person, it becomes much harder it's less comfortable and harder to stick to the strategy during market downturns and so forth.
I think it's such a great point. And I think we'll come back to that as we kind of venture into how do we take this into the real world? How do we, how do we start to think about this when we're actually in retirement? But do you think that almost through the way that pensions have evolved, i.e. we've come out of defined benefit style pensions into defined contribution pensions in terms of the exposure to the markets that the vast majority of retirees have now, do you think it's almost been kind of spoon fed to us as a people, as a generation of retirees that, as a default, as you said, you fit into the total return bucket because I've got an invested portfolio and annuity rates are on the floor. So why would I ever touch them? Is this, if we're not starting at the right point, we might ignore the thing that actually gives us the comfort that we need, because the numbers aren't always the thing that we should look at, I think, if that makes sense. Yeah.
There's been just a lot of evolution over the past 100+ years of just retirement becoming something that exists. I mean, if you go back 100 years, there wasn't really a concept of retirement. And then suddenly, post-World War II, people might enjoy a 10-year retirement and they may have had a company pension. But then as employers, at least in the US context, this was much of this was done through employers not wanting to have that risk on their balance sheets, going into this transition to, no, your pension is a defined contribution account where it's an investment account. And so you need to save voluntarily and decide how to allocate those assets and grow that portfolio and then spend from that portfolio. And then now people are living longer and longer. So it's becoming a bigger challenge. It's more conceivable that if I work 40 years, I can save enough to fund a 10 or 15-year retirement. Now, if I'm retiring in my mid-60s, I may be looking at a 30 to 40-year retirement. And it's much more difficult to save for that. And we don't have those traditional pensions. And so people are just, I think, a bit lost about the approach to take. Plus, it's only been really the past 20 years that we understand how the investing problem changes in retirement. When you're now spending from the assets, there's a lot of differences than when you're just contributing and saving. There's this idea of sequence of returns risk, which is if there's a market downturn, when you're saving for retirement, a temporary market downturn can be good because you get to buy more shares with your savings. Post-retirement, if I'm trying to fund a particular spending goal, I have to sell a bigger percentage of what's left in my portfolio to meet that goal. And then even if the overall market recovers, it's more difficult for my investment portfolio to recover. I'm more vulnerable to the market volatility in my early retirement years that can have a disproportionate impact over my whole retirement. And in practical terms, it just means market volatility has a bigger impact for retirees than for pre-retirees. And that's really just something we've started to understand for about 30 years or so at most with this kind of research into retirement income, moving away from, well, I'm just going to plug a return number into a spreadsheet and assume my portfolio grows at that rate every year. We now realize that's not how things work, but that message has not gotten out to everyone. And that's where people don't realize it's different when you're retired. That's the whole direction of retirement income planning, is trying to present that case to a broader public.
I think what's crucial, and I've said on many podcast episodes that retirement is a man-made invention. We made up money, we've made up retirement. As you said, it's the Industrial Revolution invented almost the weekend, and you worked until you died, and now there is as you rightly said, it's gone from you might live 2 years getting a pension, then you live 10 years getting a pension. Now we're into a generation of 25, 30, 35, even 40 years probably going forward. So we've got this man-made thing that we've labelled retirement. And as you said, I think we're probably first-generation retirees of coming into this now with a pot of money and all of the anxiety around spending that pot of money that now exists. And your research, as you said earlier on, is really new. There's not a lot of research behind this. And I think people are going into it expecting it to be full of answers. And in fact, it's full of unknowns.
Yeah, it's still, in my career, was very fortunate to get into a new field right as it was developing. And so there was still plenty of work to be done. And there still is plenty of work to be done. It's a broad topic that is really new to humans. And so even financial planning more generally as an academic field, it doesn't really go back much more than before the year 2000 in the United States. So it's a really interesting time to be involved in this type of research.
I just want to pick on something, and you haven't mentioned these two kind of styles or strategies yet, but I think what really fascinates me is the work you've done on front loading and back loading our retirement spending. And I think that kind of plays into how we end up feeling like we can spend that money in the real world. Can you go into kind of your work and thoughts on if you're a front loader or a back loader, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and that's an area where I've done quite a bit of research that we can talk about. And then after that research in developing this retirement income style awareness, front loading versus back loading became one of the secondary factors that helps to explain a style. Front loading is, and again, there's no right answer about this. It's what's your preference. Front loading is, I really want to make sure I can enjoy my early retirement years. I know I'm alive. I know I'm as healthy as I'm ever going to be. I really want to maximize my lifestyle and enjoy those early retirement years. I don't want to have the regret of not spending and then just feeling like I missed out on my retirement. And by doing that, if I have to make cuts later on because there's a chance I might live a long time, I'm willing to make those cuts later on. A backloading preference is I'm really worried about getting to a situation where I outlive my assets or where I'm having to make significant cuts and living in poverty late in life. And as a part of protecting from that scenario, I'm willing to spend less in the early retirement years so that I can have a more stable or more sustainable type of spending throughout the entire retirement, no matter how long that might last. It's backloading is more of a fear of outliving your assets. And that's something that exists in some people more so than others, where how do you lean? And in terms of the retirement styles, there's correlations. The front loading characteristic tends to associate more with the total return investing scenario and the time segmentation or bucketing scenario. The backloading characteristic, the fear of outliving money, correlates with the two scenarios I described before that have more of a focus on annuities, the income protection or the risk wrap, where you're wanting to have a commitment to something that will solve for a lifetime spending need. Those individuals, more often than not, also have more concern about outliving their money. And that's the backloading preference.
And I think that goes into the work you've done around, and you mentioned kind of safe withdrawal rates. Bill Bengen has done, his kind of, I suppose, he was the first one to pull out a lot of this research and was the front runner with the 4% rule, which has obviously been challenged and wrote about and widely debated over the last 10 or so years. But I think your work around the difference between a safe withdrawal rate and an optimal withdrawal rate based on whether that trade-off between wanting to spend and enjoy whilst you're still alive and healthy versus not wanting to deplete that investment portfolio and have a reliance on other things when you get into later life. So what's your thoughts around that? How we need to think about optimizing it for what we want. And is it as black and white as that? Are people wanting front loading or back loading, or is this a mixture of both, and can it evolve?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that idea of the 4% rule as a quote unquote safe withdrawal rate goes back to Bill Bengen's research, where looking at U.S. historical data, the 4% rule did not work in other countries' data besides only the U.S. and Canada, not England or any other of these 20 developed market countries in a data set that I've looked at this with. But in the US and Canada, it's the worst case scenario, how low you had to have your spending so that you never ran out for at least 30 years if you assume you could earn the index market returns and invest about 50 to 75% stocks in the local financial markets. So there's debate about, is historical data sufficient? Maybe 4% is not really safe because it should be lower. But setting that whole discussion to the side, the idea is the 4% rule is meant to be safe. It's meant to be a low spending rate that gives you sufficient protection. You won't outlive your assets. Now, we can contrast that to the idea of an optimal withdrawal rate, which is, and it's if I have plenty of other income from outside of my portfolio, if I have more of a front-loading preference, I don't necessarily have to be as worried about depleting my investment portfolio or in practical terms about having to make bigger cuts to my spending later in retirement, because it's not the end of the world if I do deplete those assets. I have other reliable income. The more reliable income I have, the more aggressive I can be with spending from my investment portfolio. The more of a front-loading preference I have, the more I can front-load my spending. I'll spend more today with the risk of having to spend less later on. And so the optimal withdrawal rate could, even though the 4% rule may not be safe, you might still be willing to spend at a rate significantly higher than that because you are willing to make cuts to your spending in the future from your portfolio because you feel like you'll be in a good enough situation still. You have plenty of reliable income from other sources and you don't mind making those cuts later in life. And so that can allow for a higher initial withdrawal rate that's not quote unquote safe, but it's more aligned with giving you the most satisfaction from your retirement assets.
And in your experience, have you seen over this new generation of people, so over the last 15, 20, 25 years, I think, there's definitely now people are approaching retirement with more than just an invested portfolio. So, there might be property involved. They might have long-term buyouts, or they might have run a business that they've got 10 or 15 years worth of of kind of passive income as a buyout, etc. They might have rental properties. They might be very willing to downsize, or what we call right size your house, your main residence in your 80s to release equity. That's becoming more commonplace as that market's become much more tight and regulated and better. And I think all of that really allows people to maybe feel more comfortable to have a 5, 6, 7, 8% withdrawal rate for a period of time, particularly when you're in what I call those go-go years, right? That window of spending opportunity. Have you come across that? Is there more kind of flexibility to be able to think about what I might do in later life to give me the lifestyle I need?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're also understanding better about spending patterns, which the 4% rule has many assumptions built into it. And as you start to unpack those assumptions, you can get different results. But it assumes you always want your spending to grow with whatever the official government inflation rate is from the previous year. And the reality is there is this idea of go-go, slow-go, no-go years. You're not going to be spending as much in your 80s as you were in your 70s or as you were in your 60s. Spending naturally declines over time. Other than, and this may be more of a US specific issue because we have less of a socialized public healthcare system or long-term care provision. In the US, there's a spending smile. Your spending does tend to decline with age, but then later in life, you have to spend a lot more on health or long-term care related issues. In other countries, that may be less of a burden because it's more publicly provided. So then you really can plan for your spending to decline with age. And if you build in that sort of approach, that is another mechanism to allow for a much higher initial spending rate than the 4% rule might imply, because you have this built-in mechanism. You don't need to always adjust your spending for inflation. It will decline over time. And that's just another added-on reason why someone who's pretty sure that's what their spending pattern will be, they may feel more comfortable with that front-loaded type approach to retirement spending.
And I know there's research out there. I've had a conversation with our mutual friend Abraham Okunsanya, who's done a lot of work on this in the UK. But there's real data out there now that talks about the decline of real spending in retirement. Lots of people think that spending needs to go from bottom left to top right, and to keep a pace with inflation. But actually, real-time spending, I think the research suggests, quote me if I'm wrong, but real-time spending falls by about 1% a year in retirement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that sounds right. I don't know about other countries outside the US, but that is the number, I think, with David Blanchett's research in the US. It's at about that level.
And I think the realization that's there, coupled with there are other assets, I think is, this is where people are starting to and the flexibility that's involved. I think it's all pointing to everybody's unique. Everyone's situation is unique. Everyone's psychological profile or their preferences are unique. And actually, there is not one way of doing this. There are many ways to be able to provide the income that you need. And actually, I think the great thing now, Wade, is that you don't have to, at 60 or 65 when you stop work, you don't have to then commit to one thing, right? You have the ability to be able to, in later life, if things don't quite go as planned, you can buy an annuity or you can do other, there are different things that you can do flexibly to be able to get that income you need as the world or your life or circumstances change.
Right. And especially so that kind of, if someone's thinking about an annuity approach, one of the critiques of annuities is they don't provide inflation protection, but you may not really need it. Or even if you could have it, you may not want to pay extra for the inflation protection because your spending may not keep up with inflation. And because by not having that, you can put less money into that today, leaving more in your other investment portfolio. And then over time, if you do find you'd like to have more reliable income because your annuity is not keeping up with inflation, you can always revisit that decision. So absolutely, that's a way to preserve that flexibility and to draw from different approaches and to really time that out in a manner that makes you most comfortable.
So I'm really curious to take this into the real world now. So you've produced some great research and you've written some really good things on this and this kind of spending in the real world. And I think you've got 4 integrated factors, and we've touched a little bit on them, but these 4 integrated factors around longevity, risk aversion, reliable income sources, spending flexibly, and availability of reserves. I think they really resonated with me because these are, although they're the words that I'm not necessarily using with the retirees that I work with, these are definitely 4 of the main conversational points that we have when it comes to getting them to understand how much they can or what spending looks like in the real world for them. I'd love to kind of, touch on those factors with you.
Yeah, the first you mentioned, the longevity risk aversion, that's another name for something we have been discussing. The idea, it's the fear of outliving your money. So it's more, if I have high longevity risk aversion, that's the backloading preference. I'm worried about outliving my money, and so willing to spend less today to better preserve for the future. But if I have low longevity risk aversion, I have more of that front-loading preference. So I am more comfortable spending more aggressively today with a willingness to make cuts later on. And you mentioned also the idea of spending flexibility. And that's also, it's related to all this point that, especially if I have reliable income, and that was another one of the issues as well, I may be talking about what I'm spending for my investments are for more discretionary types of goals, where I may have more flexibility. If markets are doing well, I can spend more. If markets are doing poorly, I'll cut back. And if I have that sort of flexibility, that's another factor that allows me to be more aggressive with my spending because I can make those cuts as needed. If I have more reliable income from outside my investment portfolio, that's giving me a bigger floor where I'm not as vulnerable to a market downturn. I still will have my basic expenses covered. And so that can be a justification to be more aggressive with my spending. And then if I have more reserve assets outside my investment portfolio, and this is where I try to map the household balance sheet between reliable income assets, the diversified portfolio, and reserves. And reserves are assets that are not otherwise earmarked for another spending goal or for legacy, that are available for the spending shocks or contingencies, the things where I may have a big expense that I haven't budgeted for. I'll want to be able to fund that with a reserve asset that hasn't been earmarked for another purpose. And to the extent that I do have more reserve assets, I don't have to feel as obliged to preserve my other diversified portfolio assets for that purpose. That can allow me to spend more aggressively as well, all of the things being the same. So it's my longevity risk aversion, my flexibility for my spending. These are all somewhat interrelated. How much reliable income do I have? And do I have sufficient reserve assets for the unexpected? And that all works together to help me determine what kind of a approach I can take to my portfolio spending and to what's a reasonable distribution rate. And can I feel comfortable spending at that quote unquote optimal withdrawal rate? That's not necessarily the safest number in terms of preserving the investment assets, but that may be okay because I have my bases covered elsewhere.
On the point of availability of reserves, my experience is that cash is a hugely undervalued and underrated asset class in retirement. It may not be the most optimal thing to hold, and it may lose money to inflation over the longer term. But I think most people's fears relate to those shocks that you don't see coming. And that could be health, that could be market downturns, obviously a number of different things. It could be something goes majorly wrong in their house and they need repairs, whatever, divorce. So in your experience, do you see that this constant, I suppose, over the last 20 years or so, this constant push about investing your money, I do see people approaching retirement without the guidance and help of people like us and you. I think that they're typically quite underfunded when it comes to this reserve and the ability to withstand the shocks. Is that something that you've observed or see?
Yes, well, it can go both ways. If some people may not really have any sort of liquid reserves, which can be quite problematic if they have an expense. Other people may overdo it and may hold a significant portion of their overall asset base in cash, which they view as a safe asset. But when you're trying to fund a spending goal that might increase with inflation and might last for many years, cash may lock in failure, have a lower probability of having that plan work just because it's not giving any potential for higher yields and returns. So it can be overdone. But no, absolutely. Having a cash reserve can really fit into that reserve category where I don't really view it as part of my investment portfolio, but it's available for a spending shock. Or I may view it as a way to help manage that sequence of returns risk. Like if there's a market downturn, rather than selling from my portfolio, I can tap into my cash reserve as a way to bridge that market downturn. And cash may give you that drag on return performance, but as a risk management strategy, it can really help that retirement plan to manage the sequence risk while also providing a reserve for spending shocks. So it is an important part of the retirement plan. And yes, I think people may. So I guess the question of how much cash should they have, but you can definitely overdo it or underdo it. But, having anywhere from 6 months to 2 years of spending available through cash, and then however beyond that you might feel you're exposed to some sort of spending shock that could happen potentially sooner rather than later, would be the way to approach that.
I think that this kind of rational versus irrational argument out there, I think, I've spoke to many people in the fields of psychology that would love to ban the word irrational, and I do kind of I do agree with them. I think we're all perfectly rational in the decisions that we make, whether they seem irrational to the outsider, that they come from a place of learned experiences or behaviours. And I do think for most people, there's a fear there that, inflation is, at the moment, you're kind of seeing, well, inflation's at 10%, 11%. The media is ramming that down our throats, but we are seeing it when we go shopping. And I think there's this kind of fear that I must get my money invested. And actually, the more you invest, the more that some of these profiles, that sleep at night thing does end up becoming a problem, and they don't enjoy the fruits of their money because they're scared to spend it, because they haven't simply realized what's important to them. And I think, and you've said a lot in your books, it's about being prepared. This is not something that should be done kind of 6 months before you hand your notice in or you decide to step back from a career. These conversations need to be had in a way that your portfolio, to provide you with the income, to give you the reserves, to allow you the flexibility, should be discussed well in advance of you stepping back. And I think people's preparedness has somewhat gone the wrong way, because they're having this stuff rammed down their throat that they need to be staying in work and invested and keep getting the market returns. And I think it's a big problem.
Yeah, it can definitely be. And it's like the issue could be if someone is feeling like they're forced into the total return approach because they don't know their other options, but are really not comfortable with market volatility. And so they end up being overly allocated to cash, just in terms of being able to help support a better outcome. The income protection approach, putting some of that cash into an annuity that provides a monthly paycheck for the rest of their life, might give them that comfort that they're looking for, and also can then support meeting a lifetime spending goal at a much lower cost than cash would be able to do. So that might be another approach. If you feel like you need to hold too much cash, it may be because you didn't have the opportunity to recognize that there are multiple retirement income styles, and you might have got pushed into a style that you weren't necessarily comfortable with.
I think that's key, isn't it? I think that again, it's a new field, lots of research now being done by your good self, and I think the more that we can get the word out there that there are numerous ways and styles, you can break down your 4 quadrants into 8. There's different ways that we can manipulate this. There isn't just one way of doing it. I think most people think I either have to buy an annuity or I have to withdraw from an invested portfolio of stocks. I need to be in one of those camps. And I think that often is just very wrong, because we can set up a retirement income strategy based on the person sitting in front of us and their thoughts, feelings, desires, wishes, wants, fears, anxieties. There are numerous ways to be able to do that. And that's thanks to the wonderful research that you're bringing to the fore. Do you think that the kind of recent low annuity rates have almost kind of put on a back burner these conversations when they shouldn't have done? Do you think there are people that either themselves DIYing this would have looked at annuities, but they look at the rates and do a quick calculation and go, I've got to live for years and years and years and years to get my money back, and then just dismiss it because it doesn't make sense on a spreadsheet? And do you think kind of financial advisors in general have dismissed them quite wrongly because the numbers don't make sense and they haven't quite understood the person sitting in front of them?
Yes, it's kind of, I think, a bit unfortunate that annuities look a lot more attractive when interest rates are higher. And so it draws more attention, because just the reality is, in a very low interest rate world, retirement becomes more expensive. And that's blatantly obvious when you look at the annuity payout rate. And it's less obvious when you think about the investment portfolio, because a lot of times people aren't making the adjustments. They may be using software that just plugs in historical bond yields, when if the historical bond return is like 5 or 6%, but I'm now in a world where interest rates are 1 or 2%. The investments struggle as well in a low interest rate environment. And on a relative basis, the case for annuities is stronger in a low interest rate environment, because annuities, a simple income annuity, the insurance company is investing your premium in bonds, essentially. So part of your payout is return of principal, part of your payout is interest that the insurance company expects to earn. And then part of your payout is this idea of the mortality credits. It's the subsidies, the short-lived help to subsidize the long-lived. And those mortality credits are not impacted by interest rates. So because interest rates are low, they become relatively more important. And even though the cost of funding retirement with an annuity increases when interest rates are low, the cost of funding retirement with bonds increases faster than the cost of funding retirement with annuities when interest rates are low. On a relative basis, annuities have a stronger case for being used in a retirement income plan in a lower interest rate environment. But it's like you said, a lot of people just see the low payout rates and say, oh, I better hold off. And think about what happens if you're already retired and you're holding off on the annuity waiting for interest rates to rise. Well, are you then holding your bond funds in cash so they don't have the interest rate risk but may not be yielding anything? Or are you investing in bonds, which are exposed to losses when interest rates rise, which we saw clearly in 2022 with, at least in the US, like double-digit losses on bond funds of any sort of duration, reasonable duration. Then, okay, interest rates came up, the annuity payout rate is higher, but now I have less assets left. So when I multiply my lower amount of assets by the higher payout rate, I'm not necessarily any better off. And so I think that is an unfortunate misconception a lot of people have, where it's just not appreciated that on a relative basis, the case for annuities is stronger when interest rates are lower.
Yeah, that's pretty mind-blowing, isn't it? Because it's just counterintuitive to what anyone kind of thinks. Uh-huh. So really, really interesting. Wade, as we kind of enter the final stages, I really want to ask you a couple of questions. So I'm asking everyone these questions, and I'd love to get your honest answers to some of these. You've mentioned a lot about the research that you do, but what will Wade Pfau's retirement look like?
So my style is risk wrap. I am thinking about annuities, but I just recently reached the age where most annuities even become available to be sold to individuals, which is in the US 45. So I'm still quite a ways away, and it's hard to actually purchase annuities at this point when I don't really know when I'm going to retire. You don't necessarily want the income to turn on when you're still working and so forth. But I think at some point, I do anticipate layering in having my basics covered with some sort of protected income floor. But also then what that does is it gives me that risk capacity to then invest the rest more aggressively. Like I'm not a big fan of holding bonds. It's more of, instead of stocks and bonds for retirement, it's more stocks and annuities for retirement. And that's definitely the direction I feel like I'm headed towards. And even now, I don't hold much in the way of bonds, but that will continue to be the case as I transition towards annuities once I have some sort of sense around when I might like to have that income replacing earnings from labor.
Do you see yourself, and you mentioned that you've done amazing work in a short space of time, and it's a relatively new field, and you've obviously got many years in front of you. Do you see this as something you'll be doing 20, 25, 30 years down the line, that you'll still be kind of looking at these strategies and working and keeping the brain sharp?
It's hard to say, but I think to some extent, yes, I've really been fortunate to build my career around writing computer programs to test different strategies. And there's so much to do. And like recently, it's building in the complete tax code into those models so that much of that, like the 4% rule, ignores taxes. And so there's a lot of work just to build taxes into all that. And that's one of the things I've been doing recently. And yeah, there's just more and more opportunities to push deeper and deeper into it. So I think there is plenty of work still to do that could definitely keep me occupied over the medium to long-term future. Absolutely.
So I'm going to ask you to step into my shoes. So if I'm 55 and I've established that I have got enough money for the retirement that I desire, what would be your number one tip for a happy, healthy, and wealthy retirement?
Yeah, before then transitioning into retirement, there's this whole non-financial side that needs to be considered. I do focus more on the financial side, but when you think about investing in your future, it's not just investing financial assets. It's also investing in your health, investing in your relationships, investing in your hobbies and passions, so that when you leave the workforce, you have something available to replace all that. And a lot of times people might think, well, I don't have time to do X and Y and Z now because I'm working. But once I'm retired, I'll have plenty of time to do those other things. And in reality, it can be hard to make that sort of transition. Like if you haven't been investing in relationships and so forth, you can't just turn that all on at retirement. You've got to also be preparing and planning for how you'll spend your days in retirement. And it's important not to just retire because you hate your job. You need something to retire to, something to replace your job, something that gives you passion and meaning and purpose and a reason to wake up in the morning. And so you can't neglect all that as you are thinking towards that transition to retirement. And that's not the area I do focus more on the finances, but absolutely recognize these non-financial considerations are probably more important at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think a lot of the conversations I've had on the emotional behavioral side are all about identity and purpose, really. It seems to be, losing your identity is one of the biggest concerns. Retaining or, I suppose, creating a new identity is one of the biggest opportunities, but also provides a bit of anxiety. And then having that reason to pull back the duvet in the morning to continue to have purpose and continue to do something that you enjoy. But I do think it does wrap round from what we've talked about in this episode, that if you can create a financial environment, an income strategy that actually provides you with, nothing's ever going to be worry-free, right? We're always going to have something to worry about as human beings, but can take away a lot of those fears and anxieties that you have and can generate the income that you need. So then you're free to explore those opportunities. I think that's kind of, it all does interlink in really importantly, doesn't it, from that perspective?
Yes, having the finances covered can provide the freedom to fully take advantage of those other opportunities, but it doesn't give you the ability to have those other opportunities. You also have to invest in those other non-financial aspects to make sure you've got something available to do. And you have it's not just the financial resources, but also the energy and motivation and health and ability to take advantage of these new pursuits and new opportunities.
Yeah, I think that comes the title of the podcast, humans versus retirement. It is a battle that our brains kind of are in to do both, isn't it? So, Wade, I really want to thank you for your time and your wisdom and all the work that you're doing to give us as financial planners, but also the public, kind of more confidence and more ability and more ways to think about how to generate or how to live the retirement they want. So a huge thank you for taking the time in your morning to speak to us today. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you.
So links to Wade's research, to his writing and to his books will all be in the show notes. They are great reads. Some of it is orientated towards the US, but I reckon a good 80% of the books and the writing are very, very, very much applicable to us. So links to all that will be in the show notes. And all that leaves me to do is thank you, the listeners, for tuning in to the Humans versus Retirement podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with me today. Until next time, take care.
Thank you for listening to the Humans versus Retirement podcast. Subscribe to be notified when new episodes become available. We would love to have you along for the journey. If you like what you heard, then we would appreciate you taking a few minutes to leave us a review. And lastly, if you want to explore your retirement plans further, download our free 7-step retirement GPS toolkit linked in the show notes. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of TFP or Dan Haylett. This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional advice, so please always seek the advice of professionals with any questions you may have regarding your retirement.